the Sports Fluent Podcast with Anthony K. All right, next up on Sports Fluent is my favorite, as you know, topics. We're going to be talking about conspiracies and fixing sporting games. And of course, as opposed to listening to me like you do every week, I brought in a special guest, Brian Tuohy, who's written a couple of books. The newest one is called The Fix is Still In, which obviously is a follow-up to The Fix is In. Brian, how you doing?
Fine. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm going to go back before we jump into the stuff that I really want to talk about. How did you start writing about this stuff? What kind of piqued your interest to the point where you said, you know what, I'm going to write a book about this?
Well, I started off as a failed screenwriter, which was always good. And my wife kept telling me, maybe you should write a book. Maybe you should write a book. And so I thought, okay, I was always interested in sports and have always been interested in what's known as conspiracy theories. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll stick the two together, because for a long time I had seen some things that made me really question the integrity of all the sporting leagues. And I actually looked around, and there was already a book out there called like the 25 greatest sports conspiracies of all time. And I was like, oh, well, that's kind of a bummer. So then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there's really more than just, it's not really just one thing of 25 conspiracies. It's really one overarching conspiracy. And that's the idea that the leagues can manipulate their own games. And once I kind of hit upon that, I just ran with it. And so in a way, I was kind of a disgruntled fan who just turned into a researcher and noticed that there was a void in this area, and I decided to fill it.
What was the first, if there was, what was the first one that kind of said, you know what, I think that conspiracy theory or the fix, I think that actually is true. I believe that.
I think the first one that really maybe piqued my interest was Michael Jordan and his retirement, because I didn't believe it then. I was old enough, I'm not a youngster anymore. And I didn't believe it then. And then when he came back so suddenly, and I had heard, because I live in the Chicago area, some rumors that, oh, Jordan didn't really retire. He was kind of forced to step aside because of his gambling issues and that sort of thing. And that's, I think, what really dove me into this. And actually, I've done a lot of research into that, and I'm positive it's not a conspiracy theory. I'm positive that Jordan was, in fact, told to step aside by the NBA, and that whole baseball thing was just a ruse.
So let's stop there for a second, because that's a big one for me. So kind of the big ones that I've kind of covered in the past on the show, I obviously talked about that one because I'm a huge Jordan fan and back then a Bulls fan, but more so because of Jordan than anything else.
That's what everybody was then,
yeah. I'm a Lakers fan, but yeah, I took a few years off there with Jordan. Again, more of a Jordan fan. But I talked about that one. I talked about the Phantom Punch. I talked about the Kings versus Lakers, that series. So a lot of this kind of similar ones, but I like this one the best because I have, I guess, two stories that contradict each other. So I had another guest on the show, also from the Chicago area, whose dad who was a police officer, but also did security for a lot of the Bulls. And some of that was kind of one of the entourage that kind of followed around Michael Jordan. He swears that everything that he heard, everything that he saw was after Jordan's dad's, tragic death. He wanted to fulfill, his dad's dream of him playing baseball. And that's why he did it. And he had proven, right? He just three-peated. He was the greatest player on earth. There's nothing left to prove in basketball. What contradicts that is I have a friend who in university was either a roommate or on the same floor as JJ Thorne is his name, who was the son of Rod Thorne, who at the time was working in the NBA kind of in disciplinary action.
Yeah.
Who he told them, right now, granted they had been drinking, but he had told them, so we take that for what it's worth, but he had said, oh no, my dad let it slip. Just think about it, is exactly 18 months. That's the suspension for gambling. He was under investigation. I'm sure some of the things I'm about to ask you about. And he said it was 100% a suspension. So I have those two stories that contradict. So you obviously have dived deeper into this. Tell me a little bit about why you feel it's definitely a suspension.
Well, the one that, besides my own personal evidence that I've kind of accumulated from doing research and that sort of thing, really the one thing that totally blew me away is I have an acquaintance who I'd known for probably a good 10 years or so through work. And one day, and he was one of those people you'd see once every like 6 months or something like that. I didn't see him every day, but whenever you'd come in, we talk and that sort of thing. And just one time out of the blue, after knowing him for literally 10 years, and after my original book, The Fix Is In, had come out, and it talks about Jordan being what I claim is suspended for gambling and that sort of thing, I didn't bring up the subject, but somehow he started talking about my book and how sales were doing and all that. And he said, he goes, my mom was Jerry Reinsdorf's personal secretary. And I was like, oh, really? He said, yeah. And she had talked all the time about how Reinsdorf, Stern, and Jordan would get together, talk about his gambling problem, and how he had to go away. So basically, Reinsdorf's personal secretary literally confirmed the whole thing, that there were several meetings, there were plenty of worries about what was going on, and they made him go away because of the problems that it was going to happen when it came out that he was involved in gambling with, it was known he was gambling with a cocaine dealer on golf. It was known he owned $1 billion to some other guy on golf losses. He was always going to Las Vegas. He was always going to Atlantic City. Even when the team was on the road, he would leave the team, go gamble, then come back. And, it was an issue, especially just after Pete Rose and what had happened to Major League Baseball. Michael Jordan meant so much to so many people and so much money to the likes of Nike and McDonald's and Chevrolet and all the other endorsements that they couldn't have him go down the road that Pete Rose went. So I know it's a conspiracy to say, oh, this is what happened, but actually it's the best business decision that could be made for everybody involved.
Well, so that's the one that people who will say, hey, no, it's not true. They'll say, well, no, how is it a good business decision to take your best athlete, your biggest international star at his peak in his prime, and take him out of the game?
Because as soon as he went away from the game, all the investigations died. That's why. As soon as he left basketball to go play baseball, the NBA closed its own investigation, supposedly, into what Jordan was doing. All the media hype surrounding it all went from being always involved in gambling, always gambling with, on golf, he's connected to this cocaine dealer, to all of a sudden, oh my God, Jordan retired, his dad died, and now he's playing baseball. Oh, let's go follow him playing baseball because isn't that a wonderful story? So, it just wiped the slate clean. And when he came back, all the questions that were out there before his retirement were gone. Nobody asked him again. Nobody had a problem with it again.
And that's the one that for those that believe it, right, is always that too, is how do you go from him being, right, he was in court for that same thing. I think it was $30,000. Yeah. He wrote the check to that drug dealer who had said, oh yeah, he admitted it once he was under oath and said, yeah, I lost it in golf. And then the drug dealer came out and said, oh yeah, he's lost way more than that.
Yeah.
Me playing golf. So that one I know, right? That one's, everybody admits to that one. The investigation, I think that's also, everybody knows that, the comment at the press conference, if
Stern lets me back in,
right? That's the other one that everyone brings up. And then you're right. Looking back now, you think, yeah, once he left, it was all about baseball. It was all about how's he going to do baseball. And then when he came back, yeah, we didn't talk about gambling. My question though then is, I know I'm playing a bit both sides here. Was he doing anything illegal in the sense that he's a grown adult to go gamble as long as he shows up to his team meetings and plays and it's not on basketball? There was never any question that I heard that he was betting on basketball.
Well, there was
it okay? That's I guess the question.
The thing is, I forget who it was. I think it was the guy who owed $1 million to, who wrote a book about all of this, which was a trashy little book. But if I remember right, he had mentioned that a couple times he overheard Jordan on the phone talking about betting lines. Now, he didn't know if it was football, if it was basketball. I'm sure it wasn't hockey. So that's the question, was he also gambling on sports? Because let's be honest, most gamblers, especially if somebody's out there gambling on his own golf game, somebody who's known to be a heavy blackjack and poker player as Jordan was, it wouldn't be surprising if he was gambling on sports. And even if he wasn't gambling on the NBA, which he very well may not have been, he may have been gambling on NCAA basketball, who knows? But even if it wasn't on the NBA, I think just the association that could have occurred with him gambling on sports would have instantly caused people to go, okay, yeah, sure, he was just gambling on football. Yeah, I believe that.
Right. The perception,
so the perception would have killed it. And like I say, after what had happened with Rose, I think that was the nail in the coffin for the whole deal. I think they just couldn't afford to even have any questions like that and risk that money that he was tied up with.
No, that I hate to say it, it does make sense.
Well, that's the scary thing. I mean, people say, well, this is a conspiracy theory because somebody would have talked about it. Well, who? I mean, who was involved? I mean, technically, it was David Stern, Jerry Reinsdorf, and Jordan. That's the three people. That's all that was involved. And nobody had any reason to make this public knowledge. Nobody. And that's
No,
why,
because
Jordan
it
involved.
hurts the league, right? It
Yeah.
hurts the league, so no way Stern's going to do it. Your biggest star gets suspended for gambling. That kills.
Yeah.
Right? He at that point, right? He's the lone star. It's
Oh, yeah.
not
He
like
kills
Bird and
the NBA.
Magic.
He goes away. Yeah.
Right. Obviously, Reinsdorf does not want his kind of golden goose to go down in flames because I'm paraphrasing kind of a quote, but someone had asked him once, is Jordan worth $30 million a year? And again, I'm paraphrasing. He was like, do you know how much money he makes me? Like 30 million is nothing,
Yeah.
right? Based on what he makes this organization. And then obviously Jordan doesn't want that to come out, especially I think because look, I don't know if you've dove into this, but right initially when his dad was murdered, everyone started putting the blame on him and his gambling as to the reason. True or not, that's gotta, how close he was with his dad. That's gotta be the tough one, I think.
Well, even that whole murder thing is screwy. I mean, some of the things about that are still really unanswered questions. I mean, because he was gone. I forget how long it was. It was like a week or 10 days before anybody in Jordan's family reported him missing. It was really bizarre because they knew he was traveling and flying to meet some friends the night he was supposedly, pulled over, slept. That it was the next morning. He pulled over, slept, and the next morning he was supposed to fly and meet some friends. He never made that flight. He never met the friends. And yet still it was, I can't remember how long it was, but I think it was over a week before anybody was like, hey, where is he? And you would think for somebody, a family that was supposedly that close knit and everything, that, you'd have been like, well, where's dad? Shouldn't we maybe call somebody or figure out where he is? So there's a lot of questions I think that still surround that. And again, I don't know if it was really connected to his gambling, if he was really murdered because of that, or if it was just a crime of opportunity, but it still raises a lot of questions. Sure.
So that would have been, you mentioned that was in the first book. So what other, we don't want to deep dive into all of them, but can we expect from the first book? And then what are the ones that you've added here in the second book?
Well, the first book was all about just kind of making the case that this was even possible. Because, I mean, when you think about fixed games in sports, if you listen to the leagues, the NBA says it hasn't had a game fixed since the 1950s. The NHL says it hasn't happened since the 1940s. Major League Baseball says it hasn't happened since 1919 in the famous Black Sox scandal. And the NFL claims it's never happened once in its existence. Nobody's ever influenced the outcome of the game. And so what I had to do, I felt, was kind of build a case that says, look, there were a lot of other gambling scandals that occurred in all of these sports throughout history that kind of get ignored. And then there's all this criminal element, all these players who have problems of beating their spouses or girlfriends, beating children. I mean, all sorts of criminal activity there. And that this whole, system is basically rife with corruption. And so if we have all this corruption, and you can admit that these leagues are businesses, well, what makes you think they really have integrity? And if they don't have integrity, and it's not against the law, and I've proven it, that's not illegal for a league to fix its own games, well, what's stopping them? And so that's kind of the case I tried to lay out in the first book. In the second book, The Fix is Still In, I basically bring up a lot of, incidents that have happened since. It's amazing. It's been 10 years since The Fix is In came out. And I basically found a whole book's worth of stuff that come out in that 10 years to kind of update it and bring, people more up to date and up to speed with what's been going on.
So let me go back a step, because you had said that in the first book, you talked about how it's not illegal for the leagues to fix their games. So other than pro wrestling, tell me how is it not illegal? Sorry to use a double negative there, but why is it legal, I guess, for them to fix?
Well, I can basically, before I explain it, I can actually prove it. And it takes a minute it takes like a minute to prove, which it blows people's minds. But if you think about it, so here's Mark Cuban, right? He's the owner of the Dallas Mavericks, and he's, to me, the worst shark on Shark Tank, but that's another story. So he came out, and I forget what it was, maybe 4 years ago, when the Mavericks were rebuilding. He went on the Dan Patrick show. Dan Patrick asked him about tanking, and Mark Cuban said, look, when we were rebuilding, quote unquote, we did everything possible to lose games. And Dan Patrick just kind of let that slide, but that was a direct quote. A year later, Mark Cuban is on Dr. J. Julius Irving's podcast. Basically, he's asked the same question. And this time he says, what I did is we took our whole team out to dinner and I told them it's in our best interest if you guys lose. So now here you have the owner of the Dallas Mavericks telling his team, don't win. Now, first of all, that's a conspiracy by definition. And second of all, it's a fixed game, and multiple games by definition, because you have the owner telling the players, go out there and lose. I mean, that's complete opposite of what you expect in sports. Is everybody, even if you think you're going to lose, you're going to still go out there and try your hardest to win the game, but the owner's telling you don't win. And so did, Mark Cuban refund anybody's ticket money? No. Did he go to the league or to his broadcast partners and go, here's money back because we were fixing games? No. Did, Las Vegas refund the bets people had made on those games that were all fixed? No. And Mark Cuban didn't get arrested. He didn't get thrown in jail. He's not there now. It's perfectly legal for a league to fix its own games. And it's played out right in front of you, like in the NBA with game tanking. It's a proven fact that teams tank games. I mean, the Philadelphia Sixers had a name for it. They called it the process when they tanked games for 3 straight years. And nobody cares. Nobody does anything about it because it's not against the law.
Yeah, because I think they put the spin on that. Well, it's the no one likes the term that tanking, but we're not a team that can win today or contend for a championship today. So we're going to put ourselves in the best situation where we can get better draft picks and make our team better in the long run.
But that's by losing.
But it is by losing,
and it's by losing intentionally.
And
Mark Cuban literally said, I took my team out to dinner and told them it's in our best interest to lose.
Right. And his argument would be, I didn't tell them to lose. I just said, hey, it'd be in our best interest. But if you ask any coach or player, they tell, oh, no, we don't ever lose on purpose. But I guess that's what they have to say.
Yeah. But I can give you the legal reason why this is all true.
Yes, absolutely.
So basically there's 2 laws that surround this subject. One is the quiz show law, which back in the 1950s, much like I say happens with sports today, is the television networks fixed their game shows. A lot of people don't know this fact, but they fixed their game shows to make them more interesting and get better ratings. And so when that finally scandal broke and it came out because of a congressional investigation, they passed a law. But the quiz show law basically says you cannot fix an intellectual contest for television purposes. And it specifically says intellectual contest. So sports are not an intellectual contest. So therefore it doesn't fall under that. The other law that was passed was in 1964. The Sports Bribery Act was passed, and that said you cannot bribe a player, a coach, or a referee to alter the outcome of a game. So if you don't bribe someone to fix a game and it's not an intellectual contest, and yet you have something like the NFL and it tells its referees who are its employees, hey, we want you to go out there and officiate the game in this manner, which may benefit one team over another, and it alters the outcome of that game, so be it. But it's not breaking any law. And the biggest law that would come close, obviously, would be fraud. A lot of people say, well, this is fraud. But again, you had in the Spygate case, you had a Jets fan who was a lawyer sue the Patriots over Spygate for 10 years worth of cheating, basically, in the NFL. And long story short, when the Third Circuit Court of Appeals determined the case, they said, look, when you pay to see a football game, all they have to do is play football, because it doesn't mean any certain rules have to be followed. Doesn't mean certain players have to play. Doesn't even mean the other team can't cheat. You paid to see a football game. You got a football game. That's all the NFL has to do. So it's not even fraud.
They did their contractual agreement, which
obligation
was to put on a 60-minute or whatever it is sporting event that you paid for.
Exactly. So that's it. That's the only laws that abound around this. So therefore, there is no law that prevents this.
So when we normally think of fixing games, it's easy to think of it's the refs, right? Because they have almost too much control of what goes on in games. I talk about this actually a little bit later, where a ref can, because you don't see it, a ref in basketball can call 2 quick fouls in the first quarter on your star player, and people don't think of it in that first quarter as, oh my God, it's this big thing, but it changes the entire complexity of the game, rotations, right? Those sorts of things, three
Yeah.
fouls in the first half. It's a completely different game. So in your kind of research, did you find, is it more teams fixing games, leagues fixing games? I know that's a hard one to say, but, or is it the refs who are dictating or pushing the outcome of a game in a certain direction?
Well, I think with the NFL and NBA, like you said, it's definitely the referee. I mean, it's the easiest way is through the officiating to change the course of the game. I mean, like you say, and they are league employees, so therefore, again, this isn't bribery. It's just how you do your job, and that's what Tim Donaghy claimed. After he got busted by the FBI and everything in his book, he said, "Look, the NBA would send us the videos of the games and say, hey, look, we want you to call these fouls and don't call these fouls." And he said instantly the officials knew, all right, the NBA wants this team to win and that team to lose. We get it just because of how they dictated this. They didn't write anything on paper saying specifically we want team A to win and team B to lose, but they got the message and they went out there and did their job because that's what the NBA wanted. And I think the same thing happens in the NFL. You look at holding penalties and how often the league could call the foul, but how often it really is enforced, and then how selectively it's enforced and when those enforcements take place. And you can see these games get maneuvered, like you say. It doesn't take much to really alter the course of the game. But if a team's driving and suddenly they get, a holding call and they went from 1st and 10 to 1st and 20, and all of a sudden they're back in their own, section of the field as opposed to near the other team's goal, and it alters the outcome of that game. And you do that enough times, pass interference here, clipping there, and you change that course of the game. It's not that difficult. But I do think, as we've seen with gambling incidents, you could definitely get the players and coaches if you want to and get them to alter games as well.
I think you listened to the first half of the show because I use holding. I use holding as the example because we hear everyone say there's holding on every play. And
Exactly.
so it's just at the refs, subjectively to kind of pick whenever they decide to throw a flag and call holding, which I in turn said we should just make holding legal. And if it happens on every play, then make it legal. And unless he takes the person to the ground, okay, that's holding. Now, the problem there is you're going to get a bunch of huge defensive linemen flopping onto the ground every time he gets out.
Yeah.
Which probably is more dangerous. So, I answered my own question there, but, that.
Well, I was going to say, though, we just saw this play out in the NFC Championship game between the Buccaneers and Packers. And they went the entire first half without a single flag.
Right.
And then there was only 6 flags in the entire game. And the only 2 subjective calls were the helmet-to-helmet hit, which they almost had to call. And the other one was the pass interference call against the Packers, which basically gave the game to the Buccaneers right at the end there. And if you go back and look at the game and you think, well, wait, how is there not a single holding penalty on either team? And how is there not a pass interference? Because there clearly was a pass interference or should have been called on the Buccaneers when they intercepted one of Rodgers' passes, but it wasn't flagged. So how come you can go through this whole game and you let them play, which should never happen by the rule book standard, but they do. And then now with the, a minute 30 left, they call pass interference. And yet that changes really the course of the game and it ends the game. So as a fan, that should make you question what exactly is going on here.
So I want to ask you about 3 that are kind of that I've looked at the most. And we'll kind of end it on these 3. I'll give you them one at a time. The first one is you talk about the phantom punch. And I'm going to maybe go chronologically. So that's the oldest one. Everyone knows, Sonny Liston, the ties to the mob. When you see the replay a million times, it doesn't look like he really connected. My theory was always, and I didn't know this, so someone told me it was a rule. So I'm sure gonna tell me the truth. Was that the ref kind of is focused his attention on taking Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay at the time, into his corner, and he's not counting. And then he has the fight continue, and then the timekeeper kind of jumps in and says, no, there was a 10 count, it's over. So tell me what I got right, what I got wrong there, and why was that allowed to happen?
Well, from my understanding, because I have actually FBI files related to that fight, because the FBI investigated it for being fixed, and their basic conclusion was it probably was fixed. They just couldn't quite figure out who did it. But essentially, one of my favorite things is I had talked to, he passed away, but he was a really big time gambler named Lem Banker. And Lem was personal friends of Sonny Liston. And he said when people would ask Liston what happened in that fight, he would basically say, well, 3 things went wrong that night. Robert Goulet, who sang the national anthem, forgot the words. He said Jersey, I think it was Jersey Joe Walcott was the referee that night. He forgot how to count to 10. And Liston would say, and the third thing is I forgot to get up. So essentially Liston said he took a dive.
Yeah.
That he never really got hit. And really, if you're going to fix a boxing match, as a lot of people within boxing would tell you, you don't go 10 rounds and then drop. You go 1 round or 2 rounds and drop, because why get hit in the face for 10 rounds when you don't need to? So Liston knew he had to get out of there. He knew he had to lose the fight. So he did it as fast as he could. And, even supposedly Ali even said in the ring, did I hit him? Because he didn't even know he knocked him down.
It gave us one of the most iconic pictures in the history of sport. And, now I look at it different. I look at that picture, and instead of him being excited for the win, I look at him like screaming, like, get up, like I didn't hit you.
That's what he's saying.
And it changes the dynamic. And unfortunately, I never would have asked him. I had the opportunity to meet Muhammad Ali way later in life. So it was a very brief conversation, but I wouldn't have asked him anyways. But, oh man, I would have loved to have asked him, did you hit him?
Yeah.
But no, he would have hit me if I did. So
yeah, probably safety. Yeah,
safety. Stayed away from that question. Yeah. The next one is, and this one's an interesting one, because you talk about the Patriots, but not like one incident with the Patriots, right? Like just the whole dynasty of the Patriots, and how they took and I'm paraphrasing, correct me again, but how they took a coach who couldn't win with the Jets, and a 6th-round quarterback, and turned into this team that couldn't lose.
Yeah, juggernaut. Yeah. I think, it's hard to say exactly what happened, because you're talking about, a decade's worth of games and that sort of thing. But I think if you look at how the Patriots never lost at home, and they have this insane home record, which makes absolutely no sense, because there's really not a lot of home field advantage, I think, built into football. Whereas in baseball, stadiums have different dimensions. And, sure, the weather could be a factor in New England, but it's still a football field. A football field is a football field. And yet they never lose at home. And then you get this whole Spygate scandal, where they were basically busted videotaping the other coaches' signals and supposedly using them and, sending that into Tom Brady. And I think, I think it actually went further than that. And I had a guy who told me, whether true or not, so don't hold me to this, but true or not, he claimed the entirety of Gillette Stadium was wired for sound and video, and that players were monitored from the time they got off the other team bus all the way through till they got back on the other team bus, and that the Patriots knew exactly what they were doing all the time. And basically, Belichick and Brady had been cheating. And that the Spygate thing, even though it blew up, it only blew up because a former coach, Eric Mangini, busted them. And that's the only reason it got blown up. Otherwise, it probably would have kept going, because their offensive coordinator right now. He became the head coach of the Denver Broncos.
Josh McDaniels.
Yeah, McDaniels. He was caught doing the exact same thing in Denver. A lot of people forget that. And then the Patriots were just caught again, potentially doing it. What was it, last year? That they were supposedly videotaping the sidelines for a documentary or something like that.
Right.
So, I think it brings into question their whole dynasty, and even Tom Brady's legacy, despite the fact, obviously, now he's back in the Super Bowl with the Buccaneers, but still, you have to question a lot of things that surround that team because of it.
It's interesting, because the one thing with Spygate, that even when it came out, I immediately went, hold on, because at that point, and today, the Jets were terrible. Yeah. And I thought to myself, if you're going to tape a team, why the Jets? Wouldn't you, let's be honest, it'd be a different team. And then you start to hear, well, they taped these other teams, and they taped the Rams, but they didn't want, now the Super Bowl becomes into question. And so that was, although turned over to the league, it was destroyed. Do you go into that at all? And did you find anything on that?
I didn't, actually, to be honest. I hit on it briefly. I always found it bizarre that, the NFL said, well, we have the one and only tape and we destroyed it. And yet somehow Fox Sports played it, which to this day doesn't make any sense. So maybe there was more than one tape. Maybe Roger Goodell wasn't telling the whole story. And Robert Kraft is one of the more connected, owners in the league. He has a lot of power within the league. He is connected to CBS and Viacom, who are broadcast partners of the league. There's a lot going on there, I think, behind the scenes that never came out. But there's actually another really good book. I think it might just be called Spygate, that another guy wrote that was all based actually on direct media reports from day one of the scandal all the way through to the end. And he digs into it pretty well.
Do we talk about the Houston Astros at all? Or is it, hey, they were cheating, we know they were cheating, they got caught cheating?
That happened I think right after I finished writing The Fix Is Still In. So I didn't actually touch upon it much. Although what I find bizarre, which I do talk about in The Fix Is Still In, is this whole hashtag thing, where I find it amazing that, there's only been a handful of teams that have ever been really connected to a disaster. And you had, the Patriots kind of connected to 9/11. You had the Saints connected to Hurricane Katrina. You had the Las Vegas Golden Knights who were connected to that shooting out there. And you had the Houston Astros being Houston Strong. And I said, it's amazing that all these teams that are connected to a tragedy, you even had Boston Strong with the Red Sox and the Bruins, all these teams connected to a tragedy all made it to the finals. And most of them won the finals. Now, isn't that kind of bizarre? Because there have been other hurricanes, there have been other disasters that teams were never connected to and never anything came out of it. But yet these few teams, and Houston is one of them, during exactly when they were cheating, that they went on to win the World Series at the same time they were labeled hashtag Houston Strong. And again, I'm very cynical. I don't buy it. And I think, people say, well, how could you fix a baseball game? Well, clearly we know they were cheating. So if Major League Baseball knew they were cheating and they knew they were doing well because of it, maybe they just let it go because that was the storyline they wanted to run with that year, and it panned out perfectly.
The NFL Network was just playing the Patriots-Rams Super Bowl.
Yeah.
And I maybe I forgot because it's been so long ago, but they showed kind of the intro and, the clips of 9/11. And I thought, wow, what an interesting coincidence that, that year of 9/11, the Patriots, right,
Of all teams,
win the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
What a great story. What a great coincidence in sports. And yeah, I hear you. I kind of think a little bit like you do too. So it's like coincidence.
Well, yeah, I don't believe in a coincidence when it's tied to a multi-billion-dollar industry. I just don't. I mean, why would you, again, if I can prove that you can do this legally and manipulate games, it's your best interest to do so because you're going to generate more interest, get higher ratings, generate more revenue. It's going to make everybody more money. So why wouldn't you do it? And like you say, it's just, it's just so coincidental. I mean, that same year, the Yankees went to the World Series after 9/11. And all people say, well, they didn't win. Yeah, they still went to the World Series. And then, of course, they ran into Kurt Schilling and Randy Johnson in their prime. And I think they hit like a $160 for the entire World Series. They weren't going to win it, 160 for the series. So, they still got there, though. And the Patriots got to the Super Bowl that year, and the Patriots won. And it just seems kind of bizarre. I mean, it's just like, this year, and I know this is a far out conspiracy theory, but, the Buccaneers are playing in a home Super Bowl. And I said, isn't it bizarre? And I predicted this like back in week 7, I think I wrote on my website, that the year that we're all at home for the pandemic, we happen to have a home team for the first time ever playing in the Super Bowl. Isn't that just kind of a weird connection with everybody having to be home? The Super Bowl's at home this year. Just little things to think about.
Well, can we come up with a way to get my Bears to win a few more games?
I have a bear glass right here.
I right here. You won't next week because it's my children are giving it to me as a gift. There will be a Bears helmet right here. So I'm my old where I used to shoot. I used to have all my Bears jerseys. Actually, I've just painted, so I've taken them down. So last thing on the book. So the fix is still in. I was gonna say, where can we find it? But let's say that to the end. What's your biggest story, or the one that you kind of are most? Listen, I bet there's tons in the book, but what's the one? Like, if I took this book, what's the first one I should read?
Well, the first one's really the first chapter because I lay out in more detail how all this is possible and how sports are just a arm of the entertainment industry and how it's legal for them to fix games. And I just really spell it out as best and with as most evidence as I possibly can show someone. So hopefully it sticks in their brain. So the first chapter is most important, but probably in terms of scandal-wise, the last chapter, and we kind of hit upon about it, is I believe that the 3 times Muhammad Ali won the heavyweight championship of the world, all 3 fights were fixed for him to win.
Really?
That includes Liston. That's when he beat George Foreman and Zaire, and then when he beat Spinks for his last title. Because I think, and I have, FBI files related to the first one and the last one. And George Foreman, it's amazing, actually, on YouTube, you can find the video. He actually talks about all the things that went wrong in that fight and how he apparently doesn't seem to think, even though he was a losing fighter, that everything was totally on the level for that fight either.
That's I'm last one because I told you I'm a Lakers fan. So Lakers Kings.
Oh well, yeah, that
Lot
was
lot of talk about that. I think it was the game 6 where there was,
yeah,
100 fouls called against the Kings
yeah. They
and
shot
none
something like
against my Lakers.
it's like 26 free throws. I think the Lakers got in the final quarter to win that game 6. I mean, it's been called the worst officiated game in NBA history, and people just throw that out there and then they don't ask, well, why? Well, because the NBA did not want the Kings in the finals. They wanted the Lakers in the finals, and they made it happen because they have the power to do so. I think it's pretty obvious, but it's funny. I actually don't write about it, but again, also on YouTube, there's a really great long documentary that some guy put together about it all. That just it should convince you to no end that that game was fixed and that series was fixed.
Well, I look through it through my Laker colored purple and gold glasses, and I still kind of cringe when I think of that game.
Well, that's
Um,
the hard part with this is to get fans to take their fan hat off. And that's one of the things I talk about in the fixes in is you kind of are wired, and it's kind of a drug. Sports are. I mean, you really feel connected to your teams. A lot of people say we when they're talking about their favorite team, when clearly you're not a member of that team. But because of that, it's hard to get through to people this idea that this is possible because a lot of guys grew up since infancy sports fans, and they believed all the rhetoric around it. They'll give 110%, takes to the next level, and you try your best, and blah, 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 blah. And if I was in that athlete's shoes, I wouldn't, stoop to fixing the game. But that's not the reality of the world. People are athletes. Athletes are people. They have problems. They have issues that can be exploited. They have needs that, might fall out of the norm that would cause them to potentially, fix games, throw matches, what have you. But to get that through to fans and get them to think about it as the NBA is business, the NFL is a business. They're tied to, CBS and all these major networks. Then you have all these other companies, Nike, Under Armour, and everybody else making money off their back. That there's a lot of money involved, and can you just leave that up to chance?
I remember the first time I found out as a kid, all sports, but as a kid, I was really into pro wrestling. And when I found out pro wrestling, like the outcomes were predetermined, it took a long time to believe it. And
Yeah.
my point is, I get what you're saying because I don't want to believe that. Even though I'll tell you, my dad, every time his team lost, I was fixed. They're paid
Well,
off.
that's the problem.
So
Is that's the
yeah.
rally cry, the loser. It was
Yeah.
fixed.
And that's why. So I don't want to believe it, but there's so many instances where you're like, you got to question it. So I'm glad that you wrote the books because I think it does open some eyes. And it's never a bad thing to ask questions why. And I
Exactly.
don't think we do that enough. So okay, currently now. So this book was written kind of
The original
how,
The Fixes In was 2010. It came out.
and then the new one obviously just came out
Yeah,
recently.
2019. Yeah.
Are you seeing anything that's raising your eyebrow in kind of any of the sports right now? Be it, is it LeBron James with the Lakers, or they're getting an unfair push? You talked a little bit about the Bucks, but
Yeah.
any other ones that you kind of keep an eye on this?
Not really, because in a way, I've kind of lost interest.
Okay,
I hate to
fair
say it,
enough. No.
but you've seen one, you've seen them all. I do still kind of watch football, and I still occasionally basketball here, hockey here and there, baseball here and there. But it's almost more of a background thing that where something will happen, I'll look up from the book I'm reading, and be like, oh yeah. But what blows my mind about all this is when you look at sports worldwide, there are proven, I mean, beyond a reasonable doubt, soccer matches that have been fixed, tennis matches that have been fixed, cricket matches that have been fixed, rugby matches that have been fixed, all sorts of sports all over the world. And people are arrested for this, put in jail for this. Athletes are suspended for life. Owners have been involved and suspended. And yet it's one crime that happens worldwide that apparently never happens here in the United States. What other crime happens worldwide that does not occur here in the United States? None that I can ever think of. So how can we think as sports fans that even though there's proven corruption worldwide in the biggest event, World Cup, soccer, it's proven that matches have been fixed in the World Cup. It's the most watched sporting event in the world, most popular sporting event in the world, most bet upon sporting event in the world. And we know matches have been fixed here. Yet people say you can't touch a regular season NBA game, or you can't fix a football game here in the NFL. Come on. I mean, if it's happening all over the world, but not in the United States, I don't buy it. Not in the least.
Where can everyone find The Fix Is Still In?
You can go to my website, which is thefixesin.net. If people want to email me, they can find me there. They can find my books there. Otherwise, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart, amazingly, on their websites, I'll have it listed. And hopefully your local bookstore, which is probably the best place to support right now.
Perfect. Brian, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
We'll get you back in maybe after the Super Bowl if Tom Brady wins again.
I'm sure something's going to happen Sunday.
The Sport Fluent Podcast with Anthony K.